Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriot's History with Michael Allen. And as always, I am reading from the 15th anniversary edition. Just got word we are in our 41st printing now. If you have an earlier edition, as I always say, if it's before the 10th anniversary edition, you're probably going to be a little off. You'll have to sync up the headers. Otherwise, you can go by the headers. The page numbers won't sync, but you can go by the headers. But if you have the 15th anniversary edition, you should be good just going right to the page. So we are on very bottom, page 179 in America's first preemptive war. Between John Adams' conclusion of the quasi-war in 1799, renewed attacks on neutral American commerce in 1806, New England traders carried on a brisk trade with both France and Britain, earning an estimated $60 million annually. But Britain objected to a particularly lucrative aspect of this trade: Caribbean goods shipped to America in French vessels, then reshipped to France in neutral American vessels. Remember, the British didn't want you trading with France. Britain aimed to crush these, quote, broken voyages through the Orders in Council, 1806 and 1807, prohibiting American trade with France and enforced by a British blockade. When Americans tried to run the blockade, the Royal Navy seized their ships and impressed or drafted American sailors to serve His Majesty. Britain justified these kidnappings by insisting that all of the impressed sailors, ultimately numbering about 10,000 over the years, were in fact British deserters, which of course they weren't. But you had to carry papers with you at all times in case this happened. It got to the point where, your papers, vive let's see your papers. It got to be to that point, okay? Americans once again found themselves treated like colonial subjects in a mercantile system, forced yet again to demand fundamental neutral rights and the freedom of the seas. As tempers flared, the U.S. administration aimed its fury at Great Britain, not France, whose strong navy represented a greater threat to American shipping than France's. Jefferson's old prejudices now resurfaced with dangerous consequences. Failing to construct large warships as the Federalists had, Jefferson's navy consisted of some 200 single-gun gunboats incapable of anything other than intercepting ill-armed pirates or the most basic coastal defense. Jefferson avoided war for many reasons, not the least of which was that he had spent much of his administration dismantling the Federal Army and Navy, and now was in no position at all to fight on land or sea. Congress sought to accommodate his policies with the 1806 Non-Importation Act. Britain, however, was unfazed by the boycotts. This is a boycott. We're not going to buy British stuff. And continued to attack and seize shipping. An 1807 clash on the open oceans between the American ship Chesapeake and Britain's Leopard resulted in 4 Americans dead, 18 wounded, and 4 impressed. Quote, "Never since the Battle of Lexington," wrote Jefferson, "have I seen the country in such a state of exasperation." Well, Tom, you helped put it there. In order to avoid the war that should have naturally followed the Chesapeake-Leopard duel, Jefferson combined non-exportation with non-importation in the Embargo Act of December 1807. This law prohibited Americans from trading with any foreign countries until France and Britain buckled under to national and international pressure and recognized America's free trade rights. But the results of the Embargo Act were disastrous. Neither Britain nor France acquiesced, and in blatant violation of federal act, New Englanders continued to trade with Britain, smuggling products along the rugged New England coast and through ports of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. When Jefferson left office in 1809, the main results of his well-intentioned foreign policy were economic downturn, a temporarily revived Federalist opposition, and a perception by both France and England that the United States was weak and lacking in conviction. Now, you never know with matters of war, but I think it's safe to say that in 1807, Napoleon was at the absolute peak of his power. He had defeated an alliance of Russia, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and England. And he got a treaty with the Tsar of Russia that was very favorable and essentially had all of Europe under his thumb. Now, he could not effectively fight the British on the oceans because at the Battle of Trafalgar, I want to say 1806, could be 1803, I'll have to check, but it's early on there. Battle of Trafalgar, the French fleet lost for a second time, bigly, to the British Royal Navy. So the French really had no way of keeping stuff bottled up in English ports. They couldn't even bottle stuff up in European ports very well. They certainly could not invade England. Napoleon had briefly toyed with the notion of invading England and then gave it up. But by 1807, Napoleon was unbeaten on the ground in Europe. His navies didn't do well, but on the European mainland, England couldn't hope, as of that point, to beat him. And so, you never know, but it's possible that a war with the US at that time, which 5 years later became the War of 1812, might have gone a little better for America. As it was, we more or less won. We won a few of the critical battles, lost a few of the not so important battles, but we would have possibly had an overwhelming victory in 1807 if the British were afraid to send too many of their troops away from the European theater. Just food for thought. But of course, one of the big what ifs of history. Okay, we're on page 180, bottom of the page, Exit the Sage of Monticello. Former President Jefferson at last returned to his beloved Monticello in 1809. Appropriately, Monticello faced west, anticipating the future, not replaying the past. Jefferson's record had, in fact, replayed some past mistakes too often. Republicans had undoubtedly reshaped the federal government in a democratic and leaner form. Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition were nothing less than magnificent triumphs. But the technically illegal Louisiana Purchase had added more to the public domain than Washington or Adams had, acquiring, even in minimalist Jeffersonian terms, a bigger Army, Navy, and federal bureaucracy to protect and govern it. Had to have somebody to run all that territory and to protect it. The judiciary contests and foreign policy exercises, except for the decisive preemptive war against the pirates, had not advanced American interests. In losing the judiciary battles to Marshall, Jefferson's obsolete agrarian republic was scrapped away to make room for a capitalist engine of wealth creation. Moreover, his years in office had done nothing to relieve his personal debts, rebuild his deteriorating friendship with Adams, or constrain the size of government. In some ways, the nation he helped found had, like an unruly teenager, grown beyond his ability to manage it. in a way he had envisioned. His successor, fellow founder James Madison, in many ways proved a far better father for the child. This is page 181, heading Quids and Warhawks. The career of James Madison symbolized the breadth of early American republicanism. Beginning in 1787 as a Federalist advocate of a strengthened national state, Madison jumped ship in the 1790s to form a Republican opposition party, demanding a return to decentralized, agrarian, frugal, and peaceful government. It was in this philosophical mood that Madison inherited Jefferson's mantle of succession in 1809, but he also inherited the foreign policy and war fever he had helped create as Jefferson's Secretary of State. The War of 1812 naturally swung the American political pendulum back to the more vigorous nationalist beliefs of the Federalists. Returning Madison's philosophical journey to a point near, though not exactly coinciding with, his 1787 Federalist beginnings. Madison was a solemn, serious man. He lived in economic dependence on his father, who owned over 100 slaves, and repeatedly young Madison had to fall back on income from the family plantation. Outside of Washington and Hamilton, who made a living away from plantations in the city as a lawyer, the founders often weren't that well off. Both Jefferson and Madison barely made ends meet, one reason why they could never free their slaves. As Abraham Lincoln would later, Madison suffered from hypochondria as well as a nervous disorder similar to epilepsy, and his poor health limited his service in the Orange County militia. Yet his brilliance and scholarly abilities made him the youngest member of Congress in 1780. One French observer noted that Madison had the expression, quote, of a stern censor and a countenance of a person conscious of his talents and duties. Now this pallid scholar led the surging Republicans. By the way, somebody once mentioned that when he walked next to Hamilton, it was like a crow walking next to a peacock. As the Republicans amassed a huge national following during the 1800-1808 period, their Federalist opponents began to wither. This important political development was much more complex than it appears on the surface. To begin with, the Federalist Party died a slow death that was not absolutely apparent until around 1815. Throughout Madison's 2 terms in office, he faced stiff Federalist opposition and even saw a brief revival of federalism at the ballot box. At the same time, whatever ideological purity the Republicans may have possessed in the 1790s became diluted as more and more Americans, including former Federalists, flocked to their banner. That this specter of creeping Federalist nationalism was seen as a genuine threat to Republican ideological purity is evidenced in the clandestine efforts of James Monroe to wrest the 1808 Republican presidential nomination from his colleague Madison. Monroe, an old anti-federalist who had served the Jeffersonians well as a congressman and diplomat, led a group of radical, disaffected Southern Republicans known as the Quids, an Old English term for opposition leaders, tertium quids. Quids like John Randolph, John Taylor, and Randolph Macon feared the Revolution of 1800 had been sidetracked by a loss of vigilance. They complained that there was too much government debt and bureaucracy and that the Federalist judiciary had too free a rein. Quids aimed to reverse this to turn centralization by nominating the radical Monroe to succeed Jefferson. But they met defeat in the Madison-dominated Republican Congressional Caucus. That November, Madison and his running mate George Clinton, the aged New York anti-federalist, faced off against Federalist Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and Rufus King. Madison won handily 122 electoral votes to 47, yet the Federalists had actually bettered their 1804 numbers. Furthermore, they gained 24 new congressmen, a 34% increase in the process. They fared even better in 1812 with anti-war sentiment fueling support for Federalist DeWitt Clinton, who garnered 89 electoral votes to Madison's 128. This temporary Federalist resurgence was partially due to the administration's mistakes, especially the embargo, but much credit goes to the young Federalists, a second generation of moderates who infused a more down-to-earth style into the formerly stuffy Federalist political demeanor. Many young Federalists, however, bolted the party altogether and joined the opposition. A prime example is John Quincy Adams, who resigned as Massachusetts Federalist senator and joined the party of his father's arch enemies. Adams's defection to republicanism may seem incredible, yet on reflection it shows considerable political savvy. Adams had already recognized that the Federalist Party was dying, and he wisely saw there was room for moderate nationalist viewpoints in an expanded Republican Party. Most important, however, young Adams astutely perceived that his only hope for a meaningful national political career and the presidency lay within the political party of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. During his first term in office, Madison attempted to carry forward the domestic aims of the Revolution of 1800. Madison attempted Gallatin, the chief formulator of Republican fiscal policy, stayed on as Secretary of the Treasury, and he and the president continued the Republicans' policy of balanced budgets and paying off the national debt, pruning administrative and military expenditures to balance the ledgers. Republicans continued to replace retiring Federalist judges, though the new ideological breadth of the Republican Party combined Marshall's dominance of the Supreme Court tempered the impact, combined with Marshall's dominance of the Supreme Court, continued the impact of these appointments. Meanwhile, diplomatic crises continued, ultimately rendering many of the administration's domestic policies unattainable. Madison assumed office at the time when diplomatic upheaval and impending warfare made foreign policy the primary focus of his administration. The former Secretary of State certainly possessed the credentials to launch a forceful foreign policy, yet through his political party's own efforts, he lacked an army and navy to back that policy up. This fact would ultimately bring the administration to the brink of disaster. Because of strong domestic opposition to Jefferson's embargo, Madison immediately called for its repeal. He replaced it with something called the Non-Intercourse Act, 1809, which forbade trade only with France and Britain. The embargo had forbidden all foreign trade and promised to reopen trade with whichever party first recognized America's neutral rights. So in essence, they said, hey, France, England, whichever of you will be the first one to recognize our rights, we'll reopen trade with you. Well, now, who do you think is going to take that deal? The French, of course, because they have no navy. And so, yeah, they're going to say, yeah, we'll take that deal. But neither of us now has a navy to make it stick. So it's kind of a problem. This policy, a smuggler's dream, failed utterly and was replaced by Macon's Bill No. 2 of 1810, which reopened trade with both France and Britain, but again promised exclusive trade with whichever power recognized America's right to trade. Again, the French eagerly agreed, and with their weak navy, they had nothing to lose. But the British naturally resumed seizing American ships bound for France, at which point the administration was stymied. Peaceable coercion had failed. War with Britain seemed America's only honorable alternative. Pushing Madison and the nation toward war was a group of newly elected congressmen, many from the West, most notably Henry Clay of Kentucky. Known as the War Hawks, the group included Peter Porter of New York, Langdon Cheves and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Felix Grundy of Tennessee, and Clay's Kentucky colleague Richard M. Johnson. think he's later called the Tecumseh Slayer because he kills Chief Tecumseh. They elected Clay Speaker, then using this control of the the committee system. They named their own supporters to the Foreign Relations and Naval Committees. Although some of the maritime issues only touched their constituencies indirectly, the war hawks saw Britain and her ally Spain as posing a danger in Florida and in the Northwest, in both cases involving incitement of the Indians. This was a very real concern. The Indian policy had consistently failed to understand that the Indians were not one big Indian nation, that all of the Indian tribes were trying to play the white man against other Indians, and more important, were trying to play white English against white French against white Spanish, and so on and so on. So rather than a white Indian policy, you had dozens of individual machinations going on in which you needed to really know the lay of the land in terms of what tribes wanted what. And more important, and this was always lost on English and French, with English especially, negotiators, you had to understand how to negotiate. Quite frequently, it involved a great deal of deference. And English would go in basically saying, we're going to make you a colony, in essence, under the Great White King. Well, they didn't recognize the Great White King. They recognized their own chiefs. And so this is not only a foreign concept, it was ineffective, and it led to bad negotiations. Bad not in terms of cruel or deceitful, bad in terms of you never really understood who you were dealing with or what they wanted. Lawyer Robert Barnes, who's been very successful in trials and defending clients, has noted that what he first tries to do is to understand what the prosecutor wants, what makes the prosecutor happy, what makes the prosecutor tick, and then you can push the right buttons to move a prosecutor in the direction you want. Same thing with the jury. Well, these English negotiators most often had no clue as to how to negotiate effectively with the Indians. So most of these treaties ended up being dead letters or very short-lived things, which really lasted only until the next wave of settlers pushed out into Indian territories again. So while I don't agree with the entire premise, I think some of it's a little silly. There's a new book called Indigenous Continent. I can't even say the guy's name, Pekka Heinalainen. He's Finnish, I think. Pekka Heinalainen, Indigenous Continent. And if you really want an in-depth look at all of these various treaties from 1607, really from Columbus on, and how they were misunderstood on both sides, that's a great place to start. In 1811, William Henry Harrison won the Battle of Tippecanoe against British-aided Shawnee warriors in Indiana. Now remember, the Shawnees are fighting off all these other Indian groups as well, including the Iroquois, Sioux up on the other direction. So you've got multiple Indian wars occurring while multiple white wars are occurring. So let me start again. In 1811, General William Henry Harrison won the Battle of Tippecanoe against British-aided Shawnee warriors in Indiana, launching a renewed Indian war in the Old Northwest. At the same time, frontier warfare fueled expansionist desires to invade Canada and perhaps Spanish Florida as well. Southern and Western farmers openly coveted the rich North American agricultural lands held by Britain and Spain. All right, that's a good place to stop, because from there on, we go into war. We're going to war with Mr. Madison and Mr. Madison's war. So we'll pick up next time at the bottom of page 183. In the meantime, I urge you, go to the Wild World of History, check out the VIP subscription. It's only $69 a year, $6 a month. Folks, there's so much in this. There are not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 ongoing lesson series. Each series has at least 3 videos, some of them as many as 20. So there's about 40 videos in the VIP. More important for you homeschoolers, there are all of my Wild Wednesday webcasts available within the VIP package. That's more than 40 special topic history lessons, everything from the Crusades to the atomic bomb, to UFOs in history, to the war in the Pacific in World War II, to Napoleon, 40 of these. Each one's 45 minutes long. That's all a part of the VIP program. So check that out and subscribe to the VIP. While you're over there, make sure you look at our trailer. We're turning Patriot's history into a feature film. And we've already got the script in process of being written, and it's going to be incredible. We're going to talk about the Cold War and how rock and roll music brought down the Iron Curtain. And boy, do we have some great dramatic stories in this movie. You will love it. But I need your help. Buy me a coffee. They're only $5. Buy me 2 coffees, 10 copies. Help me out. And make sure you're up to date on the most recent edition of Patriot's History. And that would be the 41st printing of the 15th anniversary edition. And I will see you back here on Monday.